Can you just tell me when the Society for Psychical Research was first formed?
Well, it was formed in 1882, mainly by a group of scientists and philosophers and poets and so on, from and associated with Trinity College, Cambridge. There were a group of them, and there were a number of leading spiritualists, and they got together to apply strict scientific rules to the investigation of the paranormal. This was really in the aftermath of all the upheaval in late Victorian England that was the result of the publication of the Darwin's Origin of Species and all the uncertainty that that generated, and also the fact that spiritualist manifestations, particularly physical manifestations, were very popular then and the subject of enormous controversy as to whether they were all fraudulent. So really the society was an attempt to bring discipline, scientific discipline, into an objective investigation of the paranormal.
And how long have you been a member or actively involved?
Well, I've been a member for over 50 years. Actively involved, I would say, only in the last 10 years or so.
Okay. Now, I believe that Sir Oliver Lodge played a prominent role within the SPR. Can you tell us what his book, The Survival of Man, is primarily about?
Well, this was one of Oliver Lodge's many books. Of course, he was most famous as the inventor of radio before Marconi, and a very leading scientist for a great many years. But he became increasingly intrigued by the investigation, particularly of Mrs. Piper, a medium, and gradually, over a period of years, he became convinced that there was something genuine in the messages that Mrs. Piper was bringing, apparently from the other side. So by the time he wrote his book, I think in 1909, it was the first of many books, he had become persuaded that there were spirit forces, that materialism was quite outdated, and that some explanation had to be given for the highly evidential types of messages that were coming through her. By 1909, of course, this had been superseded by other more complicated forms of messages which were even more evidential, but we can perhaps come on to that later. So his book really was about, well, it was a sort of potted history of what had happened thus far and an indication of his gradual conversion to what eventually was, 10 years later at any rate, was an absolute conviction of the spiritistic or spiritualistic view of the survival of mankind or mankind's soul after death.
Now, can you tell me about the cross correspondences?
Well, the cross correspondences were really very fascinating, very important, but highly complex and controversial. What happened was that by the end of the 19th century, a number of leading members of the society, including Oliver Lodge, had become convinced, chiefly, though not exclusively, by their investigation of an American medium, Mrs. Piper, that the messages that she was getting through could not have been attributed to merely guesswork or speculation on the part of the mediums. I mean, enormous and elaborate efforts were made to ensure that no possibility of fraud or body language reading and so on could explain the degree of accuracy of the messages, especially those where the sitter had himself or herself no knowledge of what was being said. In other words, they were proxy sittings. They were about third parties, and very often gave information which at that time was unknown to anyone else and had to subsequently be discovered.
So would that take the form of things like the addresses of people that had died a long time ago?
Well, it could do, and in some cases, I'm not sure whether particularly addresses of people, but sufficient information about them to be checkable and not to be readily available, certainly not available to the medium. So the issue then was whether this was simply a question of ESP, extrasensory perception on the part of the medium, some telepathic communication, or a communication which envisaged the actual material. In other words, it was an ability to see things at a distance instead of merely receive messages at a distance. Clairvoyance, in other words.
Yes.
Whether it could be attributed just to the human psyche, or whether it was necessary to postulate the existence of some sort of spirits outside communicating information from beyond the grave. That was the real issue. In fact, it's been the issue ever since. Now, in order to resolve this, there appeared early in 1901 or 2 a series of communications which purported to come from 2 or 3 leading but recently deceased psychical researchers, of whom Frederick Myers was the chief one.
And they were members of the SPR, were they?
They were leading members of the SPR. The chief
Right.
one had been the president of the SPR in 1900. That's Frederick Myers, who died shortly afterwards. And messages started to come through about 4 or 5 different mediums, quite independently, in different countries and in different ways, mediums who had no connection with one another. And these messages didn't make any sense. They were sometimes phrases imported into otherwise normal sentences, which seemed totally incongruous. And when these were put together by people at the headquarters of the SPR and analysed, it was found that these messages, rather like small pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, independently made no sense, but when put together, they formed some sort of intelligent message. It might be a quotation from a poem or a reference to some picture hanging up in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, or something usually fairly arcane. And they were very complicated, and most of them required a fairly intimate knowledge of Latin and Greek and obscure poets and so on. These were people, on the whole, with a very high level of education, leisured, wealthy, upper class,
Yes.
Representing an era which, unfortunately or fortunately, has long since gone. But they were able to devote an enormous amount of time and intelligence to solving these puzzles. And these puzzles went on for a great many years. There were, I think, something like 12 mediums involved over the period of nearly 30 years when these cross-correspondences continued. Many of them were too obscure or ambiguous to be acceptable as evidence. Others were much more impressive. But the fact of the matter is that after they started to peter out in the 1930s, the experts who had had time to analyse these were still divided as to whether these were definitive evidence of the afterlife, as people like Oliver Lodge thought they were, or whether they were simply very ingenious productions of the minds, collectively or individually, of the mediums. That is the so-called super ESP hypothesis. In other words, it has to be assumed that the mediums can not only formulate or obtain information which is in itself meaningless, but somehow or other mentally communicate and coordinate diverse bits of information, disparate information which individually makes little sense, collectively does make some sense, but does make some sense of something which would almost certainly be unknown to and unintelligible to the medium. So in other words, the alternative explanation was in the minds of many people more fantastic than the explanation, the more simple explanation, that these were in fact messages derived from external sources, external to living people.
So just to summarise then, the cross-correspondences have made up, I presume there's archives of them.
Oh, masses, yes.
And there are references to them from the spirits that were present at the seances which the Skull Group...
Yes, it became pretty evident to us at a fairly early stage that what the spirit communicators were in effect saying was that we did our best to use the cross-correspondences as proof to mankind that the soul survives, that there is no death as we understand it. But in fact, we failed, not because there was anything necessarily wrong with the cross-correspondences, but because humanity just wasn't prepared to study these complex things in depth. And whatever the situation was, it had no impact on the scientific world. There are very few people, I should think, in the scientific community who have even heard of the cross correspondences and wouldn't know what I was talking about. And it's an indication of how rapidly this sort of material sort of fades away into the background and is now totally ignored by people who, although they're interested in the paranormal, associate it almost entirely with these card-calling experiments or the experiments in laboratories where people are trying to identify pictures which are seen by someone else in another room, that sort of thing. But these so-called spontaneous cases where we're dealing with things that can't be looked at in a laboratory and controlled by an experimenter under conditions which a scientist would recognize, those are, unfortunately, almost entirely ignored these days. But they constitute by far the most impressive evidence of something or other, either spirit communication or of psychic forces that we have had so far.
Now,
by far the most impressive evidence of something or other, either spirit communication or of psychic forces that we have had so far.
Now, in the Skull report, you are attending many seances, but just overall, can you tell us how many seances you think you've attended in general since you've been interested in this field?
Well, I haven't myself attended all that many seances. I mean, I attended, I don't know, it was about 28 or 29 in the Skull sittings, not only in Norfolk, England, but in Spain and in California as well. And others attended sittings in different parts of the world with the group. But of course there are lots of other small groups excuse me, sitting in their private drawing rooms with closed curtains, just by themselves, for themselves, creating allegedly physical phenomena or simply communicating with what they believe to be spirits. But they are, for the main part, very unwilling to be investigated, largely because, especially in relation to physical phenomena, the tendency, the history has been that where investigators come in, they disrupt the proceedings and they sometimes criticize and even vilify the people involved. And the history of psychical research, particularly in the annals of the Society for Psychical Research, has shown a pretty critical, or perhaps overcritical attitude to physical phenomena, not necessarily because fraud has been exposed, well, it has been exposed when that's justified, but because it can always be alleged that although they don't know how certain phenomena could have been produced, theoretically it might have been possible for fraud to have taken place, and that is sufficient to damn the thing in the eyes of the investigators.
These debunkers tend to get quite good funding through university departments, I've found. And
well, they represent for the main part orthodox scientific views, and the orthodox scientific view is that of materialism, and the general view that despite the evidence of 140 or so years of psychical research, there's really nothing in it. And this view is held with almost increasing tenacity, especially because it seems that once you've accepted the idea of even telepathy, which the great majority of ordinary people do, but science, if I can use that word to describe the established scientific forum, doesn't do. Once you've established that, or once you've admitted that, you've taken your finger, as it were, out of the little hole in the dam. And the fear is that this will sweep away all existing scientific orthodoxy and replace it by a flood of occult and superstitious belief systems anti-scientific belief systems. This is a total misconception, but it's a very widespread one.
Yes.
And it's a very genuine fear in this country, and especially in America, where this whole issue has become heavily politicized. But that's a bigger question.
Yeah, I think we should also say that, when I've been speaking to the odd medium here and there, is that they're very wary of these debunkers, and they won't invite them to the seances because they perceive them to give out a kind of bad vibration, or not to be completely enthusiastic or willing to see good results from the seances, so invariably they get excluded.
Well, I wouldn't say invariably. I can think of one case where they didn't get excluded, and I'm dealing with that at the moment. But I mean, you've put your finger on the point. The skeptic would say, well, naturally they don't invite skeptics because they know that we know enough about conjuring methods and so on to expose them, whereas the spiritualist group will say, well, the skeptic, can't be relied upon to behave himself. I mean, he'll grab at something which could be dangerous, the emanations of ectoplasm, which is associated with somehow or other with the physiological side of the medium, is very sensitive to that sort of thing. And there have been many cases where unofficial interference with ectoplasm has caused physical damage to the medium. But apart from that, your view is correct that most mediums would say that people's own psychic energy, for want of a better expression, is an important contributory element in some way we don't begin to understand the balance of the energies or whatever. Of course, people curl up their lips and say what a lot of nonsense this all is because we don't understand it. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is, and I've had certain experience of this myself, that where you get a very skeptical audience, you're less likely to get good physical phenomena than the other way around, where you get a lot of believers. But the fact that they're believers doesn't necessarily mean that everything that they see is fraudulent. But I mean, there were cases, there have been cases where skeptics have been present, and indeed, two fairly skeptical colleagues of mine were indeed present as my guests at these gold sittings when phenomena appeared. But I'm thinking of one occasion when the phenomena were very poor. Whether that's because they emanated these negative vibes, or on this occasion whether it's because the medium was unwell, I don't know. But I've just attended another sitting with an experimental sitting with a group producing physical phenomena where the medium really was unwell and had a nosebleed very shortly before, but they put on a special show for me, and there were quite impressive physical phenomena. It wasn't under controlled conditions, and I was really there to see how far they would be prepared to accept controls and what sort of controls that they would wish to, they would agree to implement. I mean, we've got to get a balance between what we want as scientific investigators and what they are ready to accept, which is compatible with the way in which the spirit forces operate. And those things we can only understand by trial and error.